only one thing to say. You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
The grocer's daughter led the Conservative Party to 3 election victories.
The real thing about Margaret Thatcher is that she didn't just lead our country, she saved our country.
Known as the Lady, she was loved with pleasure and remains a divisive figure to this day.
Emphasis on liberalisation of economies and free markets also meant that that emphasis was really put within the financial sector as well. You could say that some of the build-up of financial excesses in the 2000s and the subsequent crash found their seeds in the 80s and 90s.
Years later, Thatcher was blamed for worsening the divide between rich and poor.
responded by sending in a snatch squad. Resisted, and the police moved forward en masse in a manoeuvre well tried and tested. During the struggle that followed, one policeman was hit on the head by a stone, and several others were blown away, eventually into waiting police vans. The strikers, Scottish miners reinforced by men from North East England and Yorkshire, and countercharged. There followed some of the most violent clashes on the picket lines in Scotland for some weeks. Injured in the melee was taken away by ambulance. Genuine officials on the main gate said they cautioned against stone throwing without success, and the police say they warned the pickets before taking action. About 15 men defied the unions and carried out maintenance at Bilston during the holiday period, which has just finished. Another 15 reported for work this morning and said in total there are no more men working now than before the holidays.
elevated to the other place. But Thatcherism was still wreaking, as it had wreaked for the previous decade, the most heinous social, economic and spiritual damage upon this country. Upon my constituency and my constituents, our hospitals were running on empty. Patients were staying on trolleys in corridors. I tremble to think what the death rate for pensioners would have been this winter if that version of Thatcherism had been fully up and running this year. Our schools, parents, teachers, governors, even pupils seem to spend an inordinate amount of time fundraising in order to be able to provide basic materials such as paper and pencils. The plaster on our classroom walls were kept in place by pupils' artwork and miles of sellotape. Our school libraries were dominated by empty shelves, very few books, and those books that were there, again, were being held together by ubiquitous sellotape, offcuts from teachers' wallpaper used to bind those volumes so that they could at least hang together. But by far, the most dramatic and heinous demonstration of Thatcherism was certainly not only in London, but across the whole country in metropolitan areas, where every single shop doorway, every single night, became the bedroom, the living room, the bathroom for the homeless. They grew in their thousands, and many of those homeless people have been thrown out onto the streets from the closure of the long-term mental hospitals. We were told it was going to be called, it was called care and community. What in effect it was no care at all in the community. I was interested to hear about Baroness Thatcher's willingness to invite those who have nowhere to go for Christmas. It's a pity she didn't start building more social houses after she entered into the right. So perhaps there would have been fewer homeless people than there were. As a friend of mine said, during her era, London became a city Hogarth would have recognised, and indeed he would. But the basis to Thatcherism, and this is where I come to the spiritual part of what I regard as desperately wrong track that Thatcherism took this country into, is that we were told that everything I had been taught to regard as a vice, and I still regard them as vices, under Thatcherism was in fact a virtue. Greed, selfishness, for the weaker, sharp elbows, sharp knees, they were the way forward. We've heard much over and will continue to hear more next week. The barriers that were broken down by Thatcherism, the establishment that was destroyed. Take it. What we actually saw, the word that has been circling around with stars around it, is that she created an aspirational society. It aspired for things, as indeed one of the former prime ministers, who himself had been elevated to the House of Lords, spoke about selling off the family silver, and people knowing under those years the price of everything and the value of nothing. What concerns me is that I'm beginning to see possibly the re-emergence of that total traducing of what I regard as being the basis spiritual nature of this country, where we do believe in society, where we do believe in communities, where we do not leave people to walk by on the other side. That isn't happening now. And if we go back to the heyday of that era, I think we will see replicated yet again the extraordinary human damage that we as a nation have suffered from, the talent that has been totally wasted because of the inability to genuinely see the individual value of every single human being. My old friend from country had produced. I'm a generation who was raised by when men had all gone to war to defend our freedoms. They didn't just run a government, they ran a country. And the women that I knew who raised me and millions of people like me who ran our factories and our businesses, put out the fires when the bombs dropped, they would not have recognized their definition of womanliness as being incorporated an iconic model of Margaret Thatcher to pay tribute to the first Prime Minister deputed by female gender. Okay, but a woman not on my terms.
Since Churchill, regardless of
You never had to wonder where Margaret Thatcher stood on the issues.
I will not change just to court popularity.
She was able to be uncompromising, especially when it came to her principles of economic and individual freedom.
She was called the Iron Lady, unbending and driven, respected and feared. Whether it was ideology or economics, trade unions or terrorists, it was agree with Maggie or get out of the way.
Right, the uncompromising Iron Lady, the woman who saved Britain. Look, it's no surprise that the media is exploiting public emotions over her death and turning her into some sort of heroic demagogue, which is perhaps the most dangerous part. The idea that after her death, criticizing her leadership and the role she played in global politics is taboo. Allowing this one-sided narrative to cement her legacy means ignoring the ugly side of history. For example, don't expect a cry from the people in Argentina for the former British premier who led the Malvinas War in 1982, and was responsible for sinking one of their Navy ships, which killed 32 sailors on board. Claudia Remisara of the Hispanic New York blog iterates, to some Argentinians, Thatcher is like Hitler is to Britain in the 1940s, a big monster. You won't find any sympathy for her at a popular level. Look, these may seem like harsh words, but they're merely a reflection of the continued public sentiment. But perhaps she was never Despite campaigns for the release of Nelson Mandela from prison, call for the isolation from the South African government, Thatcher remained comfortable with the idea of apartheid, once referring to Mandela and the African National Congress as a typical terrorist organization. But her divisive politics weren't limited to what was happening across the pond. This was especially true in Northern Ireland, where the 11 years of Thatcherism is still widely regarded as the worst period of the conflict. Her policy of militarization and censorship created deep sectarian division and threw basic human rights to the wayside. In Britain, Thatcher decided the style of tyrannical austerity and strict devotion to privatization, taking on unions and divide and conquer strategy, referring to dissenters from the labor movement as an enemy from within. Needless to say, Margaret Thatcher was a tyrant, an autocratic demagogue who cared more about corporate control and profit than she did about human rights. But the coverage of her death serves as a reminder of the intent of the corporate media to ignore the ugly side of history and instead revere establishment figures almost as deities, influential and infallible. To not discuss the dark side of this reality out of respect for her recent passing is not only irresponsible, it's a propaganda technique that whitewashes history. History we learn from if we allow it to be trusted.
I'm so glad to hear that Margaret's got dementia. It's a kind of thing that just not would have sent her.
Bye.